The Shoemaker and the Revolution, Alfred F. Young. Much has been written about the heroes of the American Revolution, men like Thomas Jefferson and John Hancock. In contrast, little is known about the ordinary men and women whose actions prompted Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence and Hancock to sign it in large, bold letters. In the following selection, Alfred F. Young provides us with the opportunity to view the coming of the Revolution through the eyes of an ordinary citizen, a Boston shoemaker named George Robert Twelves Hughes, who once repaired a shoe for John Hancock. Hughes lived to be nearly 100, and in his old age was interviewed at length by two writers, James Hawkes and Benjamin Thatcher. Young, in turn, has relied heavily on the Hawkes and Thatcher interviews. As you read Young's essay, note the rigid class distinctions that existed in pre-revolutionary Boston. Note also how Hughes's social outlook and political views changed. What caused him to become a revolutionary? Why didn't he remain loyal to the king, as one of his brothers did? And above all, what caused him to stop being a tongue-tied, deferential shoemaker and become a defiant citizen who, quote, would not take off his hat to any man? Late in 1762 or early in 1763, George Robert Twelve Hughes, a Boston shoemaker, in the last year or so of his apprenticeship, repaired a shoe for John Hancock and delivered it to him at his uncle Thomas Hancock's store in Dock Square. Hancock was pleased and invited the young man to come and see him on New Year's Day and bid him a Happy New Year, according to the custom of the day, a ritual of noblesse oblige on the part of the gentry. We know of this episode through Benjamin Bussey Thatcher, who interviewed Hughes and wrote it up for his Memoir of Hughes in 1835. On New Year's Day, as Thatcher tells the story, after some urging by his master, George washed his face and put his best jacket on, and proceeded straight away to the Hancock house, as it is still called. His heart was in his mouth, but assuming a cheerful courage, he knocked on the door and took his hat off. The servant came. "Is Squire Hancock at home, sir?" inquired Hughes, making a bow. He was introduced directly to the kitchen and requested to seat himself while report should be made above stairs. The man came down directly with the new varnish of civility suddenly spread over his face. He ushered him into the sitting room and left him to make his obeisance. Hancock remembered him and addressed him kindly. George was anxious to get through, and he commenced in desperate speech as a pretty one, he says, as he may knew how, intended to announce the purpose of his visit and to accomplish it in the same breath. "Very well, my lad," said the squire. "Now take a chair, my lad." He sat down, scared all the while, as he now confesses, almost to death, while Hancock put his hand into his breeches pocket and pulled out a crown piece, which he placed softly in his hand, thanking him at the same time for his punctual attendance and his compliments. He then invited his young friend to drink his health, called for wine, poured it out for him, and tinked his glasses with him, a feat in which Hughes thought he had never seen it performed before, having acquitted himself with a creditable dexterity, hastened to make his bow again, and secure his retreat, though not till the squire had extorted a sort of half-promise from him to come the next New Year's, which, for a rarity, has never discharged. This episode is a demonstration of what the 18th century called deference. Another episode catches the point at which Hughes had arrived a decade and a half later. In 1778 or 1779, after one stint in the war on board a privateer and another in the militia, he was ready to ship out again from Boston. As Thatcher tells the story, here he enlisted, or engaged to enlist, on board the Hancock, a 20-gun ship, but not liking the manners of the lieutenant very well, who ordered him one day in the streets to take his hat off to him, which he refused to do for any man. He went aboard the Defense, Captain Smedley of Fairfield, Connecticut. This, with a vengeance, is a casting off of deference, not looking up to anybody. What had happened in the intervening years? What had turned the young shoemaker, tongue-tied in the face of his betters, into a defiant person who would not take his hat off for any man? And why should stories like this have stayed in his memory 60 or 70 years later? Between 1768 and 1775, the shoemaker became a citizen, an active participant in the events that led to the Revolution, an angry, assertive man who won recognition as a patriot. What explains this transformation? We have enough evidence to take stock of Hughes's role in three major events of the decade: the massacre in 1770, the Tea Party in 1773, and the tarring and feathering of John Malcolm in 1774. The presence of British troops in Boston beginning in the summer of 1768, 4,000 troops in a town of fewer than 16,000 inhabitants, touched Hughes personally. Anecdotes about soldiers flowed from him. He had seen them march off to the transports at the Long Wharf. He had seen them every day occupying civilian buildings on Griffin's Wharf near his shop. He knew how irritating it was to be challenged by British sentries after curfew. His solution was to offer a swig of rum from the bottle he carried. More importantly, he was personally cheated by a soldier. Sergeant Mark Burke ordered shoes allegedly for Captain Thomas Preston, picked them up, but never paid for them. Hughes complained to Preston, who made good and suggested he bring a complaint. A military hearing ensued at which Hughes testified. The soldier, to Hughes's horror, was sentenced to 350 lashes. He remarked to the court that if he had thought the fellow was to be punished so severely for such an offense, bad as he was, he would have said nothing about it. And he saw others victimized by soldiers. He witnessed an incident in which a soldier sneaked up behind a woman, fell her with a fist, and stripped her of her bonnet, cardinal muff, and tippet. He followed the man into his barracks, identified him. Hughes remembered him as Private Kilroy, who would appear later at the massacre, and got him to give up the stolen goods, but decided this time not to press charges. Hughes was also keenly aware of grievances felt by the laboring men and youths who formed the bulk of the crowd, and the principal victims at the massacre. From Hawks and Thatcher, 3 causes can be pieced together. First in time, and vividly recalled by Hughes, was the murder of 11-year-old Stephen Snyder of February 23, 10 days before the massacre. Snyder was of a large crowd of schoolboys and apprentices picketing the shop of Theodophilus Lilly, a merchant violating the anti-import resolutions. Ebenezer Richardson, a paid customs informer, shot into the throng and killed Snyder. Richardson would have been tarred and feathered, or worse, had not Whig leaders intervened to hustle him off to jail. At Snyder's funeral, only a week before the massacre, 500 boys marched 2 by 2 behind the coffin, followed by 2,000 or more adults, the largest funeral perhaps ever known in America, Thomas Hutchinson thought. Second, Hughes emphasized the bitter fight 2 days before the massacre between soldiers and workers at Gray's rope walk down the block from Hughes's shop. Off-duty soldiers were allowed to moonlight, taking work from civilians. On Friday, March 3rd, when one of them asked for work at Gray's, a battle ensued between a few score soldiers and rope workers, joined by others in the maritime trades. The soldiers were beaten and sought revenge. Consequently, in Thatcher's words, quite a number of soldiers, in a word, were determined to have a row on the night of the 5th. Third, the precipitating events on the night of the massacre, by Hughes' account, were an attempt by a barber's apprentice to collect an overdue bill from a British officer. The sentry's abuse of the boy and the subsequent harassment of the sentry by a small band of boys that led to the calling of the guard commanded by Captain Preston. Thatcher found this hard to swallow. A dun from a greasy barber's boy is rather an extraordinary explanation of the origin or one of the occasions of the massacre of the 5th of March. But at the trial, the lawyers did not. They battled over defining boys and over the age, size, and degree of aggressiveness of the numerous apprentices on the scene. Hughes viewed the civilians as essentially defensive. On the evening of the massacre, he appeared early on the scene at King Street, attracted by the clamor over the apprentice. "I was soon on the ground among them," he said, as if it were only natural that he should turn out in defense of fellow townsmen against what was assumed to be the danger of aggressive action by soldiers. He was not part of a conspiracy. Neither was he there out of curiosity. He was unarmed, carrying neither club nor stave, as some others did. He saw snow, ice, and missiles thrown at the soldiers. When the main guard rushed out in support of the sentry, Private Kilroy dealt Hughes a blow on his shoulder with his gun. Preston ordered the townspeople to disperse. Hughes believed they had a legal basis to refuse. They were in the King's Highway and had a good right to be there as Preston. The 5 men killed were all working men. Hughes claimed to know 4: Samuel Gray, a rope worker; Samuel Maverick, age 17, an apprentice to an ivory turner; Patrick Carr, an apprentice to a leather breeches worker; and James Caldwell, second mate on a ship, all but Christopher Addicks. Caldwell, who was shot in the back by standing by the side of Hughes, and the latter caught him in the arms as he fell, helped carry him to Dr. Thomas Young in Prison Lane, then ran to Caldwell's ship captain on Cold Lane. More than horror was burned into Hughes's memory. He remembered the political confrontation that followed the slaughter, when thousands of angry townspeople faced hundreds of British troops massed with ready rifles. The people, Hughes recounted, then immediately chose a committee to report to the governor the result of Captain Preston's conduct and to demand him satisfaction. Actually, the people did not choose a committee immediately. In the dark hours after the massacre, a self-appointed group of Patriot leaders met with officials and forced Hutchinson to commit Preston and the soldiers to jail. Hughes was remembering the town meeting the next day, so huge that it had to adjourn from Faneuil Hall to the traditional meeting place that held only 1,200, to Old South Church, which had a room for 5,000 or 6,000. This meeting approved a committee to wait on the officials and then adjourned, but met again the same day, received and voted down an offer to remove one regiment, then accepted another to remove two. This was one of the meetings at which property bars were let down. Anyone can join. What Hughes did not recount, but what he had promptly put down in a deposition the next day, was how militant he was after the massacre. At 1 a.m., like many other enraged Bostonians, he went home to arm himself. On his way back to the townhouse, with a cane, he had a defiant exchange with Sergeant Chambers of the 29th Regiment and 8 or 9 soldiers, all with very large clubs or cutlasses. A soldier, Dobson, asked him how he fared. He told him very badly to see his townsman shot in such a manner, and asked him if he did not think it was a dreadful thing. Dobson swore it was a fine thing, and you shall see more of it. Chambers seized and forced the cane from Hughes, saying I had no right to carry it. I told him I had as good a right to carry the cane as they had to carry clubs. The massacre had stirred Hughes to political action. He was one of 99 Bostonians who gave depositions for the prosecution that were published by the town in a pamphlet. Undoubtedly, he marched in the great funeral procession for the victims that brought the city to a standstill. He attended the tempestuous trial of Ebenezer Richardson, Snyder's slayer, which was linked politically with the massacre. He remembers to this moment even the precise words of the judge's sentence, wrote Thatcher. He seems to have attended the trial of the soldiers, or Preston, or both. 4 years later, at the Tea Party on the night of December 16, 1773, the citizen volunteered and became the kind of leader for whom most historians have never found a place. The Tea Party, unlike the massacre, was organized by the radical Whig leaders of Boston. They mapped out a strategy, organized the public meetings, appointed the companies to guard the tea ships at Griffin's Wharf, among them Daniel Hughes, George's brother, and planned the official boarding parties. As in 1770, they converted the town meetings into meetings of the whole body of the people, one of which Hutchinson found consisted principally of the lower ranks of the people, and even journeymen, tradesmen were brought in to increase the number, and the rabble were not excluded. Yet there were diverse gentlemen of good fortunes among them. So all sorts of people. The boarding parties showed the same combination of ranks, Hawkes wrote. On my inquiring of Hughes if he knew who first proposed the project of destroying the tea, to prevent it being landed, he replied that he did not. Neither did he know who or what number were to volunteer their services for that purpose. But from the significant allusion of some persons in whom I had confidence, together with the knowledge I had of the spirit of those times, I had no doubt but that a sufficient number of associates would accompany me in that enterprise. The recollection of Joshua Wyeth, a journeyman blacksmith, verified Hughes's story in explicit detail. It was proposed that young men, not much known in town and not liable to be easily recognized, should lead in the business. Wyeth believed that most of the persons selected for the occasion were apprentices and journeymen, kind of lower people, as was the case with myself living with Tory masters. Wyeth had but a few hours' warning of what was intended to be done. Those in the officially designated parties, about 30 men better known, appeared in well-prepared Indian disguises. As nobodies, the volunteers, anywhere from 50 to 100 men, could get away with hastily improvised disguises. Hughes said he got himself up as an Indian and daubed his face and hands with coal dust in the shop of blacksmith. In the streets, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to place of our destination. At Griffin's Wharf, the volunteers were orderly, self-disciplined, and ready to accept leadership. When we arrived at the wharf, there were three of our number who assumed an authority to direct our operations, to which we readily submitted. They divided us into 3 parties for the purpose of boarding the 3 ships which contained the tea at the same time. The name of him who commanded the division to which I was assigned was Leonard Pitt. Lendell Pitts, actually. The names of the other commanders I never knew. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. But for Hughes, there was something new. He was singled out of the rank and file and made an officer in the field. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied and delivered the articles, but requested me at the same time to do no damage to the ship or rigging. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute his orders. First, cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found on the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. We then quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other or taking any measures to discover who were our associates. Very secret hush-hush. This was Hughes' story via Hawks in the 1830s. Thatcher, who knew a good deal more about the Tea Party from other sources, accepted it in its essentials as an accurate account. He also reported a new anecdote which he treated with skepticism, namely that Hughes worked alongside John Hancock throwing tea overboard. And he added that Hughes, whose whistling talent was a matter of public notoriety, acted as boatswain, that is, as the officer whose duty it was to summon men with a whistle. That Hughes was a leader is confirmed by the reminiscence of Thomas Maxwell, a teamster from a neighborhood town who was making a delivery to Hancock the day of the event. Hancock asked him to go to Griffin's Wharf. I went accordingly, joined the band under one Captain Hughes. We mounted the ships and made tea in a trice. This was done. I took my team and went home as an honest man should. Captain Hughes. It was not impossible. So this guy seems to verify that Hughes was made captain. As the Tea Party ended, Hughes was stirred to further action on his own initiative, just as he had been in the hours after the massacre. While the crews were throwing the tea overboard, a few other men tried to smuggle off some of the tea scattered on the decks. One Captain O'Connor, whom I well knew, said Hughes, came on board for that purpose, and when he supposed he was not noticed, filled his pockets, and also the lining of his coat. But I had detected him, and gave information to the captain of what he was doing. We were ordered to take him into custody, and just as he was stepping from the vessel, I seized him by the shirt of his coat, and in attempting to pull him back off, I tore it off. They scuffled. O'Connor recognized him and threatened to complain to the governor. You had better make your will first, quoth Hughes, doubling his fist expressively, and O'Connor escaped, running the gauntlet of the crowd on the wharf. The next day we nailed the skirt of his coat, which I had pulled off, to the whipping post in Charlestown, the place of his residence, with the label upon it, to shame O'Connor by popular indignation. A month later, Hughes won public recognition for an act of courage that almost cost his life, and precipitated the most publicized tarring and feathering of the Revolution. The incident that set it off would have been trivial at any other time. On Tuesday, January 25th, 1774, at about 2 p.m, the shoemaker was making his way back to his shop after a dinner. According to the very full account in the Massachusetts Gazette, Mr. George Robert Twells Hughes was coming along 4th Street near Captain's Ridgeway, and found the redoubted John Malcolm standing over a boy, who was pushing a little sled before him, cursing, damning, threatening, and shaking a very large cane with a very heavy ferrule on it over his head. The boy at that time was perfectly quiet, notwithstanding which Malcolm continued his threats of striking him, which Mr. Hughes, conceiving if he struck him with that weapon he must have killed him outright, came up to him and said to him, "Mr. Malcolm, I hope you are not going to strike this boy with that stick." Malcolm had already acquired an odious reputation with patriots of the lower sort. A Bostonian, he had been a sea captain, an army officer, and a recent employee of the customs service, the tax collectors. He was so strong a supporter of the royal authority that he had traveled to North Carolina to fight the regulators and boasted of having a horse shot out from under him. He had a fiery temper. As a customs informer, he was known to have turned in a vessel to punish sailors for petty smuggling, a custom of the sea. In November 1773, near Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a crowd of 30 sailors had genteelly tarred and feathered him, as the Boston Gazette put it. They did the job over his clothes. Back in Boston, he made frequent complaints to Hutchinson of being hooted at in the streets for this by tradesmen, and the lieutenant governor cautioned him, being a passionate man, not to reply in kind. The exchange between Malcolm and Hughes resonated with class as well as political differences, so rich versus poor, and also loyal versus patriot. Malcolm returned, "You are an impertinent rascal. It is none of your business." Mr. Hughes then asked him what had the child done to him. Malcolm damned him and asked him if he was going to take his part. Mr. Hughes answered no further than this, that he thought it was a shame for him to strike that child with such a club as that, if he intended to strike him. Malcolm on that damned Mr. Hughes, called him a vagabond, and said he would let him know he should not speak to a gentleman in the street. Mr. Hughes returned to that he was neither a rascal nor a vagabond, and thought a poor man was in as good a credit in town as he was. Malcolm called him a liar, and said he was not, nor ever would be. Mr. Hughes retorted, "Be that as it will, I never was tarred nor feathered anyhow." On this, Malcolm struck him, and wounded him deeply on the forehead, so that Mr. Hughes for some time lost his senses. Captain Godfrey, then present, interposed, and after some altercation, Malcolm went home. Hughes was rushed to Joseph Warren, the patriot doctor, his distant relative. Malcolm's cane had almost penetrated his skull. Thatcher found the indentation as plainly perceptible as it was 60 years ago. This is in the 1830s. So did Hawks. Warren dressed the wound, and Hughes was able to make his way to his magistrate to swear out a warrant for Malcolm's arrest, which he carried to a constable named Justice Hale. Malcolm, meanwhile, had retreated to his house, where he responded in white heat to taunts about the halfway tarring and feathering in Portsmouth, with "Damn you, let me see that man dare to do it better." In the evening, a crowd took Malcolm from his house and dragged him on a sled into King Street, amidst the huzzas of thousands. At this point, several gentlemen endeavored to divert the populace from their intention. The ensuing dialogue laid bare the clash of conceptions of justice between the sailors and laboring people heading the actions and the Sons of Liberty leaders. The gentlemen, the leaders, argued that Malcolm was open to the laws of the land, which he would undoubtedly award a reasonable satisfaction to the parties he had abused, that is, the child and Hughes. The answer was political. Malcolm had been an old, impudent, and mischievous offender. He had joined in the murders at North Carolina. He had seized vessels on account of sailors having a bottle or two of gin on board. He had, in other words, behaved in the most capricious, insulting, and daringly abusive manner. He could not be trusted to justice. When they were told that the law would have its course with him, they asked what course had the law taken with Preston or his soldiers, with Captain Wilson or Richardson, and for their parts they had seen so much partiality to the soldiers and the custom house officers by the present judges that while things remained as they were, they would, on all such occasions, take satisfaction in their own way and let them take it off. The references were to Captain Preston, who had been tried and found innocent of the massacre, the soldiers who had been sent off with token punishment, Captain John Wilson, who had been indicted for inciting slaves to murder their masters but never tried, and Ebenezer Richardson, who had been tried and found guilty of killing Cider, sentenced, and then pardoned by the Crown. They were upset with their kind of justice. The crowd won and proceeded to a ritualized tarring and feathering, the purpose of which was to punish Malcolm, force recantation, and ostracize him. With these and such like arguments, together with the gentle crowding of persons not of their way of thinking out of the ring, they proceeded to elevate Mr. Malcolm from his sled into a cart, and stripping him to the buff and breeches, gave him a modern jacket, a coat of tar and feathers, and hied him away to a liberty tree, where they proposed to him to renounce his present commission and swear that he would never hold another inconsistent with the liberties of his country. But this he obstinately refusing, they then carted him to the gallows, passed a rope around his neck, and threw the other end of it over a beam as if they intended to hang him. But this maneuver he set at defiance. They then basted him for some time with the rope's end, and threatened to cut his ears off, and on this he complied, and they then brought him home. Hughes had precipitated an electrifying event. It was part of the upsurge of spontaneous action in the wake of the Tea Party that prompted the Whig leaders to promote a committee for tarring and feathering as an instrument of crowd control. The committee made its appearance in broadsides signed by Captain Joyce June, a sobriquet meant to invoke the bold cornet who had captured King Charles in 1647. The event was reported in the English newspapers, popularized in 3 or 4 satirical prints, and dramatized still further when Malcolm went to England, where he campaigned for a pension and ran for Parliament, without success, against John Wilkes, the leading champion of America. The event confirmed the British ministry in its punitive effort to bring rebellious Boston to a heel. What was lost to the public was that Hughes was at odds with the crowd. He wanted justice from the courts, not a mob. After all, he had sworn out a warrant against Malcolm, and he could not bear to see cruel punishment inflicted on a man any more than on a boy. As he told the story to Thatcher, when he returned and saw Malcolm being carted away in tars and feathers, his instant impulse was to push after the procession as fast as he could with a blanket to cover his shoulders. He overtook them, the crowd, at his brother's house, and made an effort to relieve him. But the ruffians who now had the charge charge of him about the cart pushed him aside and warned him to keep off. This may have been the Good Samaritan of 1835, but the story rings true. While the very excitement which the affront must have wrought upon him began to rekindle, Hughes conveyed no hatred for Malcolm. The denouement of the affair was an incident several weeks later. Malcolm recovered from his wounds and went about as usual. "How do you do, Mr. Malcolm?" said Hughes very civilly the next time he met him. "Your humble servant, Mr. George Robert 12 Hughes," quoth he, touching his hat genteelly as he passed by. "Thank ye," thought Hughes, "and I'm glad you have much learned better manners at last." Hughes's mood was one of triumph. Malcolm had been taught a lesson. The issue was respect for Hughes, a patriot, a poor man, an honest citizen, a decent man standing up for a child against an unspeakably arrogant gentleman who was an enemy of his country. Hughes's role in these three events, fits few of the categories that historians have applied to the participation of ordinary men in the Revolution. He was not a member of any organized committee, caucus, or club. He did not attend the expensive public dinners of the Sons of Liberty. They were wealthier. He was capable of acting on his own volition without being summoned by any leaders, as in the massacre. He could volunteer and assume leadership, as in the Tea Party. He was at home on the streets in the crowds, but he could also reject a crowd, as in the tarring and feathering of Malcolm. He was at home in the other places where ordinary Bostonians turned out to express their convictions, at funeral processions, at meetings of the whole body of the people, in courtrooms at public trials. He recoiled from violence to persons, if not to property. The man who could remember the whippings of his boyhood did not want to be the source of pain to others, whether Sergeant Burke, who tried to cheat him over a pair of shoes, or John Malcolm, who almost killed him. It is in keeping with his character that he should have come to the aid of a little boy facing a beating. Nevertheless, Hughes was more of a militant than he conveyed or his biographers recognized in 1833 and 1835. He was capable of acting on his own initiative in the wake of collective action at both the massacre and the Tea Party. He had public notoriety, Thatcher tells us, for his whistling talent. Whistling was the customary way of assembling a crowd. According to Malcolm, Hughes was among the tradesmen who had several times before affronted him by hooting at him in the streets. And the patriots whose names stayed with him included Dr. Thomas Young and William Montagu, two of the Sons of Liberty, who replaced Ebenezer McIntosh as mob leaders. What moved Hughes to action? It was not the written word. Indeed, there was no sign he was much of a reader until old age, and then it was the Bible he read. "My whole education," he told Hawks, "consisted only of moderate knowledge of reading and writing." He seems to have read one of the most sensational pamphlets of 1773, which he prized enough to hold on to for more than 50 years. But he was certainly not like Harbordle Dorr, the Boston shopkeeper who pored over every issue of Boston newspapers, annotating Britain's crime for posterity. Hughes was moved to act by personal experiences that he shared with large numbers of other plebeian Bostonians, regular people. He seems to have been politicized not by the Stamp Act, but by the coming of the troops after 1768, and then by things that happened to him, or things he saw, or the things that happened to people he knew. Once aroused, he took action with others of his own rank and condition, the laboring classes who formed the bulk of the actors of the massacre, the Tea Party, and the Malcolm affair, and with other members of his family. His uncle Robert, known for a staunch Liberty boy, and his brother Daniel, a guard at the tea ship. Shawbell, alone among his brothers, became a Tory, a loyalist. These shared experiences were interpreted and focused more likely by the spoken than by the written word, and as much by his peers at taverns and crowd actions as by leaders in huge public meetings. As he became active politically, he may have been a growing awareness of his worth as a shoemaker. He may also have responded to the rising demand among artisans for support of American manufacturers, whether or not it brought him immediate benefit. He most certainly subscribed to the secularized Puritan ethic, self-denial, industry, frugality, that made artisans take to the non-importation agreement with its crusade against foreign luxury and its vision of American manufacturers. But what ideas did Hughes articulate? He spoke of what he did, but very little of what he thought. In the brief statement he offered Hawks about why he went off to war in 1776, he expressed a commitment to general principles as they had been brought home to him by his experiences. "I was continuously reflecting upon the unwarrantable sufferings inflicted on the citizens of Boston by the usurpation and tyranny of Great Britain, and my mind was excited with an unextinguishable desire to aid in chastising them." When Hawks expressed a doubt as to the correctness of his conduct in absenting himself from his family, Hughes emphatically reiterated the same phrases, adding to a desire to aid in chastising them the phrase, "and securing their independence." This was clearly not an afterthought. It probably reflected the way many others moved toward the goal of independence, not as a matter of original intent, but as a step made necessary when all other resorts failed. Ideology thus did not set George Hughes apart from Samuel Adams or John Hancock. The difference lies in what the revolution did to him as a person. His experiences transformed him, giving him a sense of citizenship and personal worth. Adams and Hancock began with both. Hughes had to arrive there, and in arriving he cast off the constraints of deference. The two incidences with which we introduce Hughes's life measure the distance he had come, from the young man tongue-tied in the presence of John Hancock to the man who would not take his hat off to the officer on a ship named Hancock. Did he cast off his deference to Hancock? Hughes' affirmation of his worth as a human being was a form of class consciousness. Implicit in the idea, I am as good as any man regardless of rank or wealth, was the idea that any poor man might be as good as any rich man. This did not mean that all rich men were bad. On the contrary, in Boston, more than any other major colonial seaport, a majority of the merchants were part of the Patriot Coalition. Diverse gentlemen of good fortunes, as Hutchinson put it, were with the rabble. This blunted class consciousness. Boston's mechanics, unlike New York's or Philadelphia's, did not develop mechanic committees or mechanic consciousness before the Revolution. Yet in Boston, the rich were forced to defer to the people in order to obtain or retain their support. Indeed, the entire public career of Hancock from 1765 on, distributing largesse, buying uniforms for Pope Day marches, building ships to employ artisans, can be understood as an exercise of this kind of deference, proving his civic virtue and patriotism. Hughes, in effect, had brought Hancock down to his own level. The poor shoemaker had not toppled the wealthy merchant. He was no leveler. But the rich and powerful, the men in ruffles, had become, in his revealing words, his associates. John Hancock and George Hughes, breaking open the same tea chest at the Tea Party, remained for Hughes a symbol of a moment of equality. To the shoemaker, one suspects, this above all was what the revolutionary events of Boston meant, as did the war that followed.